Hello, and welcome to Gaspar's History Podcast. This is Gaspar, and I'm continuing the Meat Hound series with Episode 6, First Over Germany. This story is about Steele and the 306 Bomb Group as they make their first bombing mission to Germany as part of the 8th Air Force. That makes this an important story as it relates to World War II, aviation history, but even more important to those listening that have family history related to that. So, with that, let's jump right in and find out what happens on this historic day. In our last episode, Old Friend, we heard how the star of the series, 42-29524, started her transatlantic trip over to England and how her travels would take her on an exotic trip which ultimately lands her in Thurley with the 423rd Bomb Squadron in March of 1943. In the meantime, the 306 Bomb Group has other business that they are taking care of. First, they fly a mission on January 3, 1943, to see their old friend, the submarine pens at St. Nazaire, and how the bomb group lost 3 aircraft on that mission, and it took them 5 days to complete. It was a crazy mission, and the results sent shockwaves through the unit. As we go back in time to January 27, 1943, the soon-to-be Meat Hound is hanging out in Salina, Kansas, in the middle of a month-long respite before she heads east again. This morning, Steele wakes up around 2 a.m., wondering like the rest where he will be flying today. The unit has seen some pretty significant changes since Steele and Jones flew the Unbearable to see their old friend at St. Nazaire. After the disaster that was an old friend, the 306 got a new bomb group leader, Colonel Frank Armstrong. Colonel Armstrong replaced the well-liked Colonel Charles Overacker Jr., which was a bit of a surprise, but this was the Army, Steele thought, and they were going to do what they thought was best, so you better get used to it. For the love of God, I hope they don't think powdered eggs are best for breakfast this morning. The bomb group was not overly fond of this leadership change, nor of powdered eggs, but we will see they get adjusted, and they work their way into it. Another significant change was the leader of the 368 Bomb Squadron, Major Lanford, who led the last mission to St. Nazaire, our old friend, was relieved and replaced by the highly liked and respected Captain Mac McKay. This was a blow to the 423rd Bomb Squadron, but Steele thought good for Mac, but we will miss his leadership. Also, on the 13th of January, which is another special birthday day, so happy birthday out there, Captain Johnson, flying 4 of a kind, who we were introduced to in the St. Nazaire mission, and Lieutenant Spaulding, who was wounded in the St. Nazaire mission. Well, they collided during a mission to Lille, and only 4 parachutes were seen from both aircraft, and both of these pilots were killed, and both of these aircraft were lost. Steele and his crew had been with the squadron for about a month and a half, and to see all this change, and to be losing all of these friends, well, it was getting pretty tough to swallow. The new leader would be leading the mission today, so Steele thought it had to be a good one for whatever that was worth. He got some coffee and warmed his hands around the thick Vita Field china cup. He tried to eat a little, even if they were not powdered, but it was hard before a mission because your nerves and adrenaline ran high. But the eating was getting easier, which Steele thought was not necessarily a good thing. By 4 a.m., the mission room was filled with pilots, navigators, and bombardiers. The tension in the room was so thick it was hard to ignore. The crews were sitting together, making small talk. Everyone was staring at the big blue cloth hiding the large mission map. Colonel Armstrong came into the room with Major Putnam by his side. Everyone jumped to attention, and after protocol, with very few pleasantries, Colonel Armstrong announced the mission. Captain Reagan recalled the colonel's words, "Gentlemen, this is it." And the big blue cloth fell to the ground. There was a silent pause, and then the room erupted. Have you ever been waiting for something, then got it, then hesitated, and said, "Whoa"? That is what it must have been like. Captain Reagan recalled that after the announcement, everything until Germany was anticlimactic. The briefing, the loading, the takeoff, the rendezvous, the channel, everything was anticlimactic until we saw Germany. To Germany we would go, Steele thought. If you thought visiting an old friend was tough, well, Germany was probably twice as bad. There was still no official number of missions a crew needed to fly before they could go home. And now that missions to Germany were on the list and were on the schedule, Steele was thinking no one was ever going to make it home. Colonel Armstrong was going to lead the mission and be first over Germany. The primary target was the submarine manufacturing plant at Vigasac, and the secondary target were the docks at Wilhelmshaven. Wilhelmshaven was about 380 miles from London and located in the northwest corner of Germany. "Okay, team, follow me," aircraft number 368 bellowed as she rolled onto the tarmac, and her 4 Wright Cyclone engines revved with excitement. "Listen to those power plants hum. I think we're ready to go." Colonel Armstrong and Major Putnam were behind the controls of aircraft number 368, and they would be the tip of the spear into Germany. The 306 Bomb Group was going to get the honor of leading the mission for the 8th Air Force, and Colonel Armstrong and Major Putnam would be in the pilot seats. Also in aircraft 368 is Bombardier Frank Yalsey from Winifred, Kansas, and the potential classmate of Steele's from flight school in California. Colonel Armstrong was flying a Clay Pigeons aircraft and crew, which was probably intentional, to help overcome any superstition and to continue to build some confidence back into the squadron. Flying in the number 2 slot today was Lieutenant Edward Hennessy with Lieutenant Rogers Littlejohn in aircraft number 488, which was named Banshee 2. The 3rd slot in the lead element was the beloved Lieutenant Raymond Check of the 423rd Squadron, who was well-liked and a respected pilot. Lieutenant Check was flying with Bart Wigington, who came in with Steele on the truck on December 11th. Lieutenants Check and Wigington were flying aircraft 720, which was a no-named F-Beauty. Leading the 2nd element is the 423rd Bomb Squadron, and our friend, Lieutenant William Uncle Bill Warner, with another name that's known to us, Steele's Swedish co-pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Arnold Carlson. As we've heard, Warner and Carlson have been flying several missions together, and today they will have the honor to fly to Germany together. Their aircraft was 42-5717, a no-named F-Beauty that was delivered as a late Thanksgiving present in 1942. They were familiar with this aircraft and comfortable with her. The rest of the crew are Lieutenant Utley is navigator, Lieutenant Kylius is the bombardier, Tech Sergeant Wilson is the engineer, Tech Sergeant Espitalier is manning the radio, Staff Sergeant Morgan is in the ball turret, Tech Sergeant Bezak is on the waist gun, as is Staff Sergeant Kissling. They are all familiar to us. The only new name is Staff Sergeant William E. Williams, who is in the tail. Staff Sergeant Williams was from Hamilton County, Florida. He was single, 20 years of age, and had a year of college under his belt before he had joined the Army in 1942. Staff Sergeant Williams was new to this crew, but he was not new to combat, and he was serving as the tail gunner on B-17 number 4224496 Chenault's Pappy when the aircraft was attacked by Focke-Wulf 190s after leaving the target area near St. Nazaire, their old friend, on the 17th of November, 1942. This was the mission where no aircraft were lost, but engineer Tech Sergeant Allenbach was killed, and 3 crew members were injured as the planes suffered severe damage. Staff Sergeant Williams was uninjured in that attack, so Williams had plenty of experience, and he was good to have on board. Second Lieutenant Warren George and Second Lieutenant Robert Mallon bring aircraft 717 neatly into the number 2, tucked off the right tail of Lieutenant Warner and Second Lieutenant Carlson. And this no-named F-Beauty is Second Lieutenant Simmons navigating and Second Lieutenant Meade Warner, who, as you remember, also came in with Steele on that truck on December 11th. In the last episode, I incorrectly identified Meade Warner as a pilot and not a bombardier, who was flying as a replacement, but after further research, it appears Meade was formally listed as a bombardier. Therefore, in the visit to the old friend, the best bomb pattern was in fact by a bombardier. Also flying with George, Mallon, and Meade, Warner, is the squadron's artist, Staff Sergeant Don Bevan, in his right waist gun position. With the loud roar of her engines, Old Faithful 425714 slides into the number 3 slot of the second element, with Lieutenant Jones as the pilot and Second Lieutenant Steele as the co-pilot. Just a reminder, Master Sergeant and Crew Chief Joseph Tarana is taking care of the Old Faithful, and Crew Chief Tarana would be credited with servicing a plane that flew over 100 missions. Unfortunately, it would not be the Old Faithful, and hopefully that is no foreshadow for the mission today. Flying with Jones and Steele today on this historic mission are Navigator Second Lieutenant Pollock, Bombardier Second Lieutenant Kisberth, Engineer Staff Sergeant Bamforth, Radio Operator Tech Sergeant Stymax, Ball Turret Gunner William Hull, Right Waist Gunner Hobbs, Left Waist Gunner Curran, and the tail gunner is James Smoot. This was an experienced crew, but again, a crew that was pieced together and had never flown together on a previous mission. Navigator Eugene Pollock was originally on Mac McKay's crew, but with Mac now leading the 368 Bomb Squadron, Eugene found himself with Jones and Steele was happy to have the experience, even if it wasn't his old friend, Orman Hamilton. Our old friend Mac McKay was leading the 2nd Squadron, which was on the right side of the bomb group today. He was leading it in a no-named F-Beauty number 129. He had Montana Power, plane number 465, tucked into the number 2 slot, and that was being flown by Lieutenant Reber and Lieutenant Lally, who are 2 pilots that we are familiar with in our story. In the number 3 slot, coming up, is Lieutenant Buddenbaum and Lieutenant Maxwell Judas, and they were flying another no-named F-Beauty, plane number 466. Leading the second element of the 2nd Squadron was Captain Raper in 4124514, and his co-pilot today was 2nd Lieutenant Robert Fryer. But as they went through the engine rev, one of the engines lost manifold pressure, and they failed to take off, and they would not be a part of the mission today. That left pilot Lieutenant Fred Galogli and co-pilot Lieutenant Aaron Kudbach in the 24507 to take the lead, and that they did, with Captain John Reagan flying with Lieutenant Teddy Jankowski in 425251 coming in alongside them in the number 2 slot. The 2nd Squadron was now in the air, and the 3rd Squadron was coming up next. Captain John Ryan was leading the 3rd Squadron today, and he had Lieutenant Joe Downing as his co-pilot. Downing had been with the squadron for just under a month, and Captain Ryan was a good pilot to gain experience from. They were flying plane number 130, Sweet Pea. I think now is a good time to tell you a little bit more about the Sweet Pea. The December 20th, 1942 Deja Vu mission was the first mission in which aircraft number 130 had been named and christened Sweet Pea. The Clay Pigeon Squadron was an early war, hard-luck squadron that no matter what was happening, they were getting shot to pieces and losing crews. In early December, the squadron decided they would adopt an orphan and sponsor them, hoping this good deed would change their luck. So, non-commissioned officers Combs, Ward, and Dabney headed for London to adopt an orphan. They were hoping for a Butch, and they were introduced to a 3-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed Maureen, who politely said, "I like these soldiers," and gave them a hug. The deal was done. Maureen was adopted. The squadron had collected enough money to sponsor her for 5 years. Yes, 5 years, which was a pretty nice sum of money. Maureen started to visit the squadron, and aircraft number 130 had Sweet Pea, Maureen's nickname, stenciled on her side, and on December 20th, 1942, Captain Ryan took Sweet Pea to Ramillies-Hussein, where she was shot to pieces, but ultimately returned safely. And after that, the clay pigeons saw a little more favor and had a little bit more luck. Most people have heard of the Memphis Belle, but let's be honest, the Sweet Pea has a much better backstory. Finishing out the lead element with Captain Ryan is Lieutenant George Buckey and Lieutenant Craig Harwood in plane number 072, along with Lieutenant Malazewski and Lieutenant Frank Watson in CIS, aircraft number 978. The mission report shows Lieutenant Malazewski flying CIS, the B-17F model olive drab beauty with CIS on the right side running at a vertical angle, with a big-hatted girl in a very short skirt standing just outside the co-pilot's window. CIS may not have the backstory that Sweet Pea does, but we have records and photos that she existed, and today, based on the mission report written by Colonel Armstrong, she would take off and be a part of the mission to Germany. The second element of the last group has one of my favorite planes, piloted by Lieutenant Robert Riordan and Lieutenant Edris, the Wahoo 2, plane number 086. The last plane into the formation was piloted by Captain Robert Smith and Second Lieutenant Ray Fortin, and they were flying aircraft 175. Captain Robert Smith was in the 423rd Bomb Squadron, but he was flying a 367th Bomb Squadron plane and crew for today's mission. Captain Smith was also in flight school at the same time as Steele in California, near the same field, so again, I wonder if they'd run into each other during training or social events. As I mentioned, the 306 Bomb Group had the honor of being the tip of the spear today, and they were followed by the 303rd Bomb Group very closely. The order after that does not seem to be documented. I'm sure it is, but it's not in any of the reference material that I have access to. So, with that said, let's make sure that we also understand the 91st and the 305th bomb groups were also in on this mission. As the bomb groups were crossing the English Channel and getting into formation, planes started to drop out of the formation and head back home due to various malfunctions and failures. It was not long until CIS, with Lieutenant Malazewski, had some issues with her ball turret gun not charging. The link chute on the top turret also jammed, hadn't heard of that one before, and then they lost the oxygen to the ball turret, and just like that, she was out of the mission and headed back to Thurley. Then, a little bit of an oddity occurred. Captain Reagan and Lieutenant Jankowski in aircraft 42-5251 were cruising at 23,000 feet when shell casings came crashing through the nose of their ship, putting a good-sized hole in her. Navigator Lieutenant Kawakowski and Bombardier Lieutenant Owens quickly filled the hole with clothes to help slow the frigid air from coming through the aircraft. Captain Reagan was asking what was going on, and the reply was that shell casings from the planes ahead and above came crashing through their nose after the other planes had charged and tested their guns. Even after examining the positions of the aircraft, it's hard to tell which plane these shell casings came from. There is a chance that they did come from Jones and Steele and the Old Faithful. Radio man Tech Sergeant Hoffman let the squadron know that they had broken nose cone and that they were headed back to Thurley. With that, Captain Reagan eased 42-5251 into a soft left bank and dropped altitude as Lieutenant Kazakowski ciphered a new way home. Captain Reagan and his crew were more than disappointed, but they had no choice but to turn back, and it makes one wonder that when something as odd as that occurs, what other fates are at work. With Captain Reagan headed back to Thurley, that left the 306 with 15 aircraft headed for Germany. By the time that Captain Reagan got back to Thurley, he was greeted by a gaggle of reporters and a hero's welcome. Word was out. The bomb group was headed to Germany, and the reporters had shown up in droves to get a lead on the story. Unfortunately, Captain Reagan only had a partial story, but like any good storyteller, I'm sure he had some ad-lib here and there and something to give him. Attacking occupied France is bad enough. I wonder what attacking Germany is going to be like, Steele wondered. Old Faithful was in good position, but something seemed a bit off, and the 150-mile-per-hour cruising speed seemed like everything was in slow motion. Steele was expecting it to be bad, and he was not too distracted from his duties, but the mind does wander, even when you're focused, and it can race through a bunch of different memories, a bunch of different things, and a bunch of different people in a very short time. Steele thought of his dad back in Greenville, Texas, his brother and sister-in-law, along with Beatrice Groover from Frostproof, Florida, who he had met when his crew and Gardner Reynolds, who he still can't believe is gone, were practicing bomb runs in Avon Park, Florida. It was just a quick memory and thought, but he did wonder how they all were. Colonel Armstrong and his no-named F-Beauty 368 kept pressing forward, and it was time for the Spitfire escorts to turn back with their usual tally-ho and warm regards, and then they were gone. It usually did not take long to get jumped after the fighter escorts had left, but today, for some reason, there were none. The bomb group was headed for the submarine production plant at Vigasach, Germany, and we are starting to understand how important it was to win the Battle of the Atlantic and cripple the German submarine fleet. Except for Ramillies Hussein in Lille, every mission has been focused on crippling the submarines, and today was no different. For those Das Boot fans out there, do you remember how it ends? Maybe that gives you a good visual of what today might be like. If you've not seen Das Boot, then I would highly recommend it. The British had been bombing Germany at night, but this was another bold 8th Air Force daylight attack. One has to wonder if it was arrogance and bravado that drove that decision. Either way, it would be a decision that would remain in place for the duration of the war, obviously no matter the cost, sadly. Major Claude Putnam, the group operation officer, was sitting in the co-pilot's seat to the right of Colonel Armstrong. We are familiar with their bombardier, Frank Yalsey. Also in the aircraft is Lieutenant Saltnik, who was the navigator. Tech Sergeant Collette was the engineer. Tech Sergeant Savage was the radio man. Raymond Erickson was in the ball turret. And the waist gunners were Charles Hill and Harvey Ross. Then there was Donald Tunstall in the tail gun position. What was it like to be a member of a B-17 crew? What kind of an impact did it have on you? It was life-changing. Frankly, World War II was life-changing for the generation of men and women that fought in that war, and it carried with them the rest of their lives. For Sergeant Tunstall, the tail gunner on this plane, it was no different. So let me share with you a story that his daughter shared with the bomb group some 50 years after the war. One day, some 50 years after the war, Donald Tunstall got to visit a B-17 as she circled an airfield and then landed. He made a tour of the aircraft, leading his daughter through the plane, sharing stories and remembering names and faces that were long since gone. It was therapeutic for Donald and his daughter, and as they exited the aircraft, he reached into his jacket pocket for his Lucky Strike cigarettes, which was his routine, his habit, but he had given that habit up years ago. But getting off that B-17 50 years later was as if he had gone back in time. The 306 was now crossing into Netherlands with Armstrong and Putnam at 22,600 feet. Steele had a really good view of the lead element, and the Old Faithful was just behind them, but above at 23,000 feet. They were flying just a bit higher today, hopefully throwing the flat crews a little curveball that they weren't looking for. Usually, as soon as the Spitfire escorts head for home, they are replaced by the Luftwaffe fighters. But today, that greeting and the Luftwaffe response is a little light, and that is unusual, especially since most missions were not really a surprise, thanks to the exhaustive work of the German spy networks. However, the flak was almost immediate, and the black puffs of smoke and the thunderous rumbling had commenced, and it would be constant for the next couple of hours. It was still a bit cloudy, so that did provide some relief. The bomb group was about 160 nautical miles from their target, and they were flying at 150 miles per hour. Jones and Steele were evading the flak, following the group lead like some kind of ballroom dance. Up 1, 2, down 1, 2, left 1, right 1. Old Faithful then lost the turbocharger in engine number 3. It was not putting out, it was just static. Lieutenant Jones was peppering Steele with questions. Steele went through the checks. Wastegate, control knob, nothing seemed to be out of line. The engineer, Leon Bamforth, he chimed in. He commented he did not see any flak damage and there does not appear to be any ruptured lines. More power would be needed for engine number 3, and their fuel consumption was going to take a hit. I can picture a scene out of Star Trek episode. "What can you give me, Steele? We need more power." The response in a Texas drawl, "I'm giving her everything she's got, Captain." The peppering of flak was constant, and the whole crew was now completely engaged. Jones was focused on the bobs and weaves, Steele was now managing a poor supercharger, and guns were in good working order today. But Old Faithful did not get a nose gun jury rig, which we will hear about in a minute. There were a few enemy aircraft spotted, but they were well off and out of range, and none of them came in on the formation. James Smoot, from his tailgun position, was calling in the 2nd Squadron position, and he had a clear line of sight to the 303rd Bomb Group, which was in a fast follow position. Then, there it was, Germany. The bomb group could see Germany, and since the briefing at 4 a.m. that morning, everything else to this point was really non-climatic. They were actually going to Germany, and the lack of the Luftwaffe's presence meant that they were going to make it. The constant peppering of flak was helping them to focus. The bomb group continued in formation with the 303rd and others aligned in formation behind them, and towards Vigasac they continued, but the cloud cover started to get bad. Colonel Armstrong then made the call. They would forego Vigasac and head for the docks at Wilhelmshaven instead. And just like that, the adjustment was made, and the concert of aircraft shifted their focus to Wilhelmshaven. It was just before 11 a.m. in the morning. The Luftwaffe knew the B-17s were not properly protected from the front, and they quickly developed a strategy to attack the nose of the B-17F in an attempt to kill the pilots and knock the large aircraft out of the sky. Crews then started to think of ways to get more protection into the front of the aircraft, while Boeing was working on the B-17G variant, which would add a nose turret to the aircraft. The mission reports today speak of the jury rigging that was done to add more protection to several of the aircraft. Our friend Lieutenant Warner in 717 makes a comment that a 50 caliber nose gun was installed in the nose, and the crew was very proud of it. Lieutenant Buddenbaum in 466 also had 50 caliber nose guns installed, as did Lieutenant Reber in Montana Power, Lieutenant Galogi in 517, and Lieutenant Hennessy in Banshee. These references provide us with good detail on how individual units made adjustments to their aircraft to improve their defensive capabilities. The mission reports speak of how these crews liked their guns, even though they really did not get to use them much today. Colonel Armstrong and Major Putnam brought the bomb group into line, and they prepared for the bomb run. The flak continued to be hot, but it was not overly effective, even though it was close enough to punch holes in all of the aircraft. The plan and course was set. They were going to bomb the dockyards at Wilhelmshaven, which was a major port for the German Navy. The aircraft were coming in from the west, and it was just after 11 a.m. The history books, the 8th Air Force Historical Society, Stars and Stripes magazine, all give credit to the 306th and Colonel Armstrong for bombing Wilhelmshaven at 11:10 a.m. on January 27, 1943, and being the first American attack on German soil. The 303rd Bomb Group challenges the time a bit to add a little argument to the story that they were actually the first at 11:11 a.m. Either way, there is a document in the mission reports from Captain Smith's aircraft 175 that they were the first to drop a bomb on Germany. As the bomb group was preparing for the bomb run on Wilhelmshaven, Captain Smith of the 423rd Bomb Squadron, with his co-pilot 2nd Lieutenant Fortin and the crew from the 367th Bomb Squadron, hear a report on the wireless radio. Staff Sergeant Gross thinks he hears over the wireless, "Drop bombs." So Captain Smith orders bombs away, and Lieutenant Edwards releases the bombs out of 175. It is 11:08, and they are near the Jever Luftwaffe airfield, minutes west of Wilhelmshaven. And it was an airfield that was created by the Luftwaffe in 1936. So if the mission reports are correct, it appears that the unofficial account is still with the 306th, but it lies with Captain Smith and plane number 175 and their crew due to a misunderstanding. The S2 in the after-action report seems to document this in very clear handwriting, so I wonder why credit was not given properly. The obvious answer to me was that Captain Smith and the crew would be killed, and there would be no one to press the issue. But the answer is a bit more of an enigma, as there are two Robert Smiths as pilots in the bomb group. One is transferred between squadrons, and at least one of them finishes their tour, sent back to the United States, where they are later killed in a training mission. And then the other? Well, I can't tell. Lieutenants Fortin and Walden, they get shot down in April and spend the rest of the war in a POW camp. And Lieutenant Edwards, he's a ghost. Captain Smith and Aircraft 175 have released their bombs. Now it's time for the rest of the bomb group. Colonel Armstrong and Major Putnam turn the aircraft over to Lieutenant Yalsey for what Armstrong reports as a 2-minute bomb run. Let me be clear, the bomb group did not have a reported aircraft attack up to this point, so their only harassment was flak and engine trouble. Bombs away. Yalsey released the 5 1,000-pound bombs, and Wilhelmshaven was under attack, and now Germany was officially attacked. At 11:10 a.m., January 27, 1943, her own soil had been bombed. How do you like that, Herman? The bombs fell 22,600 feet and crashed to the right of the right boat slip. The explosions were horrific, and the shock waves could be seen zipping through the port. The rest of the bomb group was now following. Lieutenant Hennessy and Lieutenant Check were next. Lieutenant William Colantoni, the bombardier and Banshee, hit just east of the middle boat slip. Bombardier Lieutenant Emmett Ford and Lieutenant Check's aircraft, his bombs landed 2 slips in and 1 in the water. Uncle Bill Warner and 2nd Lieutenant Carlson bring the 717 through a 40-second bomb run, and 2nd Lieutenant Kylus actually thinks he drops the bombs on Bremerhaven, well past the docks. Lieutenant George had Lieutenant Meade Warner, our friend the bombardier, and how do you think he did this week? Well, we don't know, and neither do they, as they could not see their bombs due to the smoke at the target. This was the same for the Old Faithful and 2nd Lieutenant Kisberth, but they did see some hitting the docks, they just did not see theirs. Lieutenant Wilkins, flying with Lieutenant Buddenbaum, they put their bombs on the docks. Lieutenant Reber and Lally, they put their bombs in a field thanks to a bomb rack malfunction. They were not the only ones with a bomb rack failure, as our old friend Captain Mac McKay in Aircraft 129, he also had a failure. It was about this time an ME-109 started to harass Lieutenant Buddenbaum in 466, so Tech Sergeant Robert Guthrie opened up on it and drove it away. The 306 is through the bomb run, and Steele felt like it was the longest 30 seconds of his life, but he also found it quite exhilarating. The 303rd Bomb Group is right on their tail and coming through in short order. The evasive action continues as the pilots took the planes back from the bombardiers, and the group started their left-hand turn for their boogie out of town. Uncle Bill Warner is then pelted by flak, like a kid threw a bunch of rocks at him, and the 717 is hit pretty good. The hydraulics in the flaps go out, and for some unknown reason, the gyro compass also goes out. Warnings start to light up the intercom as enemy fighters have been spotted and are swarming, but they're swarming like a bunch of lost bees with no direction. Tail gunner William Williams, another Williams from Florida, watched as a Focke-Wulf 190 made a pressing nose attack on the 303rd Bomb Group behind them, and the Focke-Wulf 190 picked the wrong plane today because it made a nose attack on an aircraft that had jury-rigged a set of 50 caliber guns in the nose, and it walked right into them, and Sergeant Williams watched as the Focke-Wulf 190 exploded and disintegrated. Scratch one bogey. The evasive action is driving Second Lieutenant George and Second Lieutenant Mallon nuts. "Geez, take it easy," George complains. The 303rd Bomb Group continues their bank left, heading out to the North Sea. And as they do, and they adjust altitude, leaving behind a smoking port as the other groups continue to deliver their messages to Hitler and Goering. A Me-109F model comes climbing up on the Banshee from 11 o'clock low. Lieutenant Colantoni was calling out the attack, and the Banshee's guns erupted a defense, and the 109F turned and banked out as fast as she came in. A couple more Me-109s were stalking the Montana Power, so her gunners sent a few rounds their way, but they were out of range, and they stayed that way. A Focke-Wulf 190 then came in from 1 o'clock on the Banshee and started to fire its 20mm cannons. Lieutenant Colantoni once again directed the fire, and the top turret gunner and engineer, Sergeant Wiley, opened up, but he missed. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Joe Bowles then unleashed a burst of Browning 50 caliber gunfire that took the right wing off the Focke-Wulf 190, and it threw her into her spin, and she never came out of it. Count one for the good guys. Steele was thinking he did not expect such a lacking effort from the Luftwaffe, but he will take it. It was very clear the Luftwaffe pilots were not as skilled as the ones in France. They were timid and unsure of their attacks, and except for a few runs, they stayed well out of range of the heavily fortified B-17F bombers. "Would you look at that?" came across the wireless. "It's the whole German Navy. Look at that." The navigators were scrambling to take coordinates as crews started to bark out ships and directions. The 306 had come up on a column of German Navy vessels, and an impressive column it was. The German flak barges started to send their greetings out, and the naval column was headed due east in the North Sea from Wilhelmshaven. Steele had a great view of the column, and the chatter was constant. Flak barges, 3 or 4 minesweepers were leading the way, 3 destroyers, a pocket battleship no less, cruisers. Captain Riordan in the Wahoo, they counted 23 ships with escorts. Wow, what a big deal, and how cool is that? Since a Graf's Bay was on the bottom of the ocean, if it were a pocket battleship, then it was either the Lutzow or the Admiral Scheer, which makes for a good story for one's grandchild. While all this convoy sightseeing was going on, Captain Ryan and the Sweet Pea got buzzed, well, maybe not buzzed, but they got passed over by a German biplane at 23,000 feet, a single-seater no less, and the Sweet Pea's crew just watched her fly by, not bothering to take a shot at her, and probably not expecting to see a pocket battleship and then a biplane within minutes of each other. Colonel Armstrong and Major Putnam brought the bomb group home with no further incident to a crowd of hungry reporters waiting for the reports of the first over Germany mission. Captain Ryan commented it looked like the whole German Navy. William Colantoni of Brownsville, PA reported the pocket battleship, if that is what it was firing at us as we flew over it. Lieutenant Hennessy and his crew closed out their briefing with, "Damn peaceful trip." The Old Faithful with Jones, Steele, and their crew landed safely but nearly out of gas, so the loss of the supercharger had an impact on the No. 3 engine's performance and ultimate fuel consumption. The crew congratulated each other, and there were smiles on their faces. Steele knew it could have been so much worse, and he could only imagine what the next one would be like because it felt like the 8th Air Force had outsmarted the Luftwaffe and landed a left hook when those yellow-nosed bastards at Brest were expecting a right jab. After the checklists were completed, they walked around the aircraft counting holes. They were lucky today. There was only 5 small holes, and none of them significant. The press was everywhere, and there was a lot of hubbub going on. Oh, and a lot of smiling. The bomb group had made it home with no aircraft losses and no crew casualties. Not bad for the first mission to Germany. The 8th Air Force staff was reporting pretty good success on the docks and the naval yard, but let's be honest, that was not the real impact of this mission. The Germans were now going to have to split their defenses and prepare for a mission on Monday to Germany and Tuesday to France. Now that a daylight bomb run was made on Germany with low losses, to note, the other bomb groups lost a total of 3 aircraft. The bar had been set. The mission was more about the symbolism of the raid and Colonel Armstrong's leadership. Think of it as a parallel to Roger Bannister's first sub-4-minute mile. What I mean is that now that the standard has been set, others will also be able to run a sub-4-minute mile, and the bomb groups know that they can now go to Germany whenever they like. However, we will see future raids to Germany get much harder, and it seems that the first trip to Germany may end up actually being the easiest trip to Germany. Who knew? January 27, 1943 was not a good day for Germany. As the 8th Air Force ceremoniously bombed the Reichsland, the Stars and Stripes was reporting how the Russians were finishing up their victory at Stalingrad. The reports state how the Germans are down to about 12,000 troops in a small pocket and, quote, liquidation was coming soon. It goes on to say that the German people had not been told of the final destruction of the Sixth Army, but the Goebbels propaganda machine was starting to hint that way. I hope the planes, pilots, and crews are starting to become familiar to you. Hopefully you, like me, are starting to have your favorites. Maybe you are starting to realize that what Hollywood produces is not always accurate. Not every aircraft is named, not every crew flies the same plane, and crews are pieced together on a regular basis just so the mission logs can be filled. In the old days, some people called this cannon fodder. It is fun to learn about the aircraft and hear their history and backstories, and even though they are pieces of machinery, they were temporary homes for these flyers. Think of it this way. If every mission you flew you were 8 to 12 hours in an aircraft, well, it would become like a second home to you. The no-named F-beauties that went to Germany today outnumbered the named aircraft, and their stories are just as fun and just as exciting. However, it is easier to attach to a name, and it is fun to wonder how that aircraft was named. Jones and Steele flew the only named aircraft for the 423rd Bomb Squadron today, the Old Faithful. The other aircraft with names that were first to Germany were Sweet Pea, and we heard her backstory, Sis, who had to return early, Wahoo 2, who is still in the story, even though she was shot up back in December, like that was a long time ago, the Banshee 2, who is also familiar to us, and lastly, for all those Yellowstone fans out there, the Montana Power. This wraps up the first mission to Germany. As we heard, there was not a lot of harassment by the Luftwaffe. The flak was constant, but it was also very ineffective. The crews reported how the Luftwaffe's pilots were simply not as experienced as the ones in France. Germany had now been bombed in the daytime by the 8th Air Force, and it would start the routine of daylight bombing by the 8th Air Force, followed by a nighttime bombing by the RAF. The noose was starting to get fitted around the neck of the German war machine. This was not some overly devastating attack that leveled Wilhelmshaven or even put the port out of commission. No, it was more of an achievement, a check mark, a goal. Colonel Armstrong had taken the 306 Bomb Group on a mission into Germany, and it did not lose a plane or a crew member. That was important to the 8th Air Force leaders, and it was important to the 306 Bomb Group. The squadrons of the 306 Bomb Group had taken an early war pounding, especially the 367th Bomb Squadron. You know when you are nicknamed the Clay Pigeons that something is askew. The 423rd Bomb Squadron had also suffered, and just in the month and a half since Steele's crews arrived, the losses had been significant. The stress and combat fatigue was wearing on all the crews and all of the squadrons, and it was starting to get some recognition. Some 8 Airforce leaders were starting to listen to the bomb squad doctors. They were screaming that combat fatigue was a real thing. Conversations had started on what was the tour of duty going to look like, how many missions were going to be required to fly before you were sent off on another assignment. Maybe the damn peaceful trip was actually a bad thing. Maybe it provided a false hope and bad data. Stay tuned as we continue to hear the story of the 423rd Bomb Squadron in Steele as he flies his way through 25 missions in a bunch of different planes and crews, including a third of his missions in the soon-to-be Meathound. Our next mission is going to combine the February 2nd and February 4th missions together, where Steele and Jones are going to take 41-24476, the Unbearable, into Germany, and they have to do some fancy flying to get her back home. Until next time, just think of the things you can find when you are looking for something else. Gaspar, out.